Kenosha is once again being pushed onto the national stage following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. In 2004, Kenosha police shot and killed 21-year-old Michael Bell Jr. in front of his family. Nearly 16 years later, Kenosha is almost repeating history. Only this time, the U.S. is dealing with a national pandemic and what some would argue is one of the most polarizing presidents in U.S. history. Now, both Republicans and Democrats are using the shooting of Jacob Blake as a focal point for the upcoming election. So with me now is Craig Gilbert. He is the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Thanks a lot for joining us, Craig. Okay. So let us talk about Kenosha, which, for many people, they may have never even heard about Kenosha. But in many ways, what is happening in Kenosha is reflected in many, many communities around the country. There is a difference between the city of Kenosha and the county of Kenosha. And it may sort of represent a political divide that we have seen frequently. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's kind of a microcosm of the state of Wisconsin, which itself is kind of a microcosm of the national political landscape. I mean, in Kenosha, it's the extreme lower right-hand corner of Wisconsin. If you're looking at a map north of Illinois on the lake, everything near the lake is Democratic, and the city is Democratic. It's a diverse city. It's an old industrial city. And then everything west of I-94, which is that big north-south highway you see, is pretty Republican. It's exurbs, it's small towns, it's suburbs, and that's a big red-blue divide in Kenosha County. Kenosha County was the closest county in Wisconsin in the 2016 election. It was decided by 0.3 of a percentage point in a state that was decided by 0.8 of a percentage point. So today is a microcosm of that political backdrop, and obviously it's a microcosm of the election in many ways, with the intersection of these big, painful social issues and a presidential campaign.
Yes. Wisconsin was once named one of the worst states for Black people to live in. Nearly 65% of the Black population actually lives in Milwaukee. How did Wisconsin get that ranking, and does it explain why the shooting of Jacob Blake has become maybe a bit of a flashpoint when it comes to police brutality and the protests that we're seeing?
So there's a long history in Wisconsin of big disparities between whites and blacks, and this is really striking in the Milwaukee metropolitan area, where you've got these, counties surrounding Milwaukee that are overwhelmingly white, and they're very Republican. And then the African-American population is heavily concentrated in Milwaukee County, and particularly in the city of Milwaukee. A lot of poverty, big education gaps, gaps that have to do with criminal justice system. These are long-standing. They are not new. Some people have argued that the migration of the African-American population from the south to the north was late occurring compared to other northern cities, and that made the kind of deindustrialization of the state all the more impactful economically on the Black community, and of course a history of racial segregation in Wisconsin as well. So this is all, sort of part of the longstanding kind of social backdrop in Wisconsin. So in some ways, what's happening is not, these are not brand new issues for Wisconsin, and obviously not for the nation.
So the president is headed to Kenosha, and that is despite the fact that the mayor and the governor have asked both him and Joe Biden not to come, that the time wasn't right now. But when you sort of describe the political landscape a little bit, I can see why the president would think that this is a good move for him. He has presented himself as the law and order president, and warned that the unrest that we are seeing in the streets of many cities, not just Kenosha, would be worse under Biden. But he's the current president now, and this is what we're dealing with. Does his law and order, the way he's positioning himself as a law and order president, does that speak to voters in Wisconsin and in the Kenosha area?
So, big question that we don't know the answer to. There was some polling before Kenosha happened. There was some polling in the state that showed that support for the protest movements, in the aftermath of George Floyd, was starting to drop. It was, around 60%. It dropped a little bit below 50%. This was before Kenosha. But it wasn't,
Mm.
at the same time, that wasn't driving up the president's numbers. It wasn't driving up his numbers on how he was handling the protests. Those were still negative. He was still trailing Joe Biden. So we don't know, and we don't have any evidence yet for whether this issue is, cutting in his favor politically, to put it crassly, or not. It's a big question. It's certainly a big question for Democrats and Republicans involved in this campaign, and it's easy to imagine it working in very different directions. I mean, you can imagine voters being disconcerted by the violence in the protests, and that maybe making the president's law and order message, quote unquote, more appealing. But you can also imagine it working the other way, where it's sort of more chaos, more turbulence. Those normally aren't good things for an incumbent president who's been getting poor marks for his handling not only of the pandemic, but for the protests themselves.
So, I want to ask you, he won Wisconsin in 2016. You identified how slim some of his margins were. How did he win over Wisconsin? And in light of how things have changed so dramatically in this country, you mentioned the coronavirus pandemic. Is the same strategy likely to work?
So Wisconsin is probably the most blue-collar white state of all the battlegrounds. If you look at its demographics, it's more than half the population non-college whites, and that's been a good demographic for Donald Trump. But he really has to win those voters pretty overwhelmingly. He has to win rural and small-town voters pretty overwhelmingly, because he's been soft and underperforming in not only in the cities, but in the near suburbs and in the metropolitan areas. So, his recipe for victory in 2016 was just an historic landslide in rural Wisconsin, which is a considerable vote, overcame, his weakness in metropolitan Wisconsin. So he has to sort of do that again. The challenge is that, the rural vote is not monolithic, nor is the blue-collar vote monolithic in Wisconsin. I mean, there are rural parts of the state that are going to be harder for him to win this time around, because they have a history of swinging, and they have a history of voting Democratic at the top of the ticket. So he's got a narrow path. I mean, it's a real path, but it's a narrow path.
So we talked a lot about Trump, but as I mentioned, the mayor of Kenosha also asked that Joe Biden not come to the city as well. Are voters satisfied with what they have heard or not heard from Joe Biden? What's the feeling about him there?
So, we went through this drama with the Democratic National Convention being located in Milwaukee, and then, what kind of convention would it be? It turned out to be a virtual convention, and Joe Biden didn't come. I mean, that has put him under some pressure. I mean, he's obviously not been campaigning, period, in any real way. But that has put him under some pressure to get out there, and particularly in Wisconsin, where famously Hillary Clinton did not come in 2016. So I think we're going to see him soon. I think those are the political imperatives.
There's been a demand throughout the country from some protesters to sort of revisit public safety. And in some cases, perhaps, you heard the phrase defund the police. And the conversation is about whether some of that money should go towards different types of tactics when it comes to public safety. Wisconsin locks up more black men than almost sort of any state in the country. Is this an issue that is of concern in the state? Is it something that voters want either Joe Biden or the president to address?
So I think it's certainly an issue that some Biden voters want the president to address. When I was talking about the political landscape, in the state, the city of Milwaukee plays a really important role there. The city of Milwaukee is between 40 and 50% African American, and one of the reasons Hillary Clinton was defeated in 2016 was that turnout was low and soft in the city of Milwaukee. She won it overwhelmingly, but not enough people voted. So this is a big piece of the puzzle in 2020. This is an issue that's going to be important to a lot of voters in Milwaukee. And so that's something that I think, Joe Biden obviously needs to talk about in terms of his own support base.
Yeah. Craig Gilbert, really great talking to you. Thank you for giving us a snapshot of what it's like there on the ground in the local area. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.